Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we venture into the frozen wilderness of Canada, where small towns harbor secrets darker than the longest winter night. 10 documented cases that defy explanation await you. These are not urban legends passed down through generations. These are real events that shattered communities and left investigators with more questions than answers. Disappearances that break the laws of physics. Crimes that remain unsolved decades later. Discoveries that forced authorities to reopen investigations they hoped would stay buried. Each story you are about to hear is backed by official records, witness testimony, and evidence that continues to haunt those who encountered it. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let's step into the isolated villages and forgotten towns of the Canadian wilderness, where help is hours away, and the truth is something far more terrifying than being alone. Ethan worked as a surveyor for a remote mining operation in northern Ontario, about 400 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. The area was as isolated as one could imagine. No cell service, no towns within an hour drive, just frozen wilderness and the tight-knit community of workers who lived in trailers on site during their rotation. It was January 2018, and the winter that year was particularly brutal. Temperatures regularly dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the wind coming off the lake could strip the warmth from exposed skin in minutes. Despite the harsh conditions, Ethan loved the work. He had been with the company for 3 years and knew the terrain better than most. He was meticulous with his equipment, always punctual, and never gave anyone reason to worry about his safety. On the morning of January 17th, Ethan woke at his usual time, 5:30 in the morning. His roommate, another surveyor named Marcus, remembered hearing him moving around the small trailer they shared. Marcus said Ethan had made coffee, the smell waking him briefly before he drifted back to sleep. When Marcus finally got up around 7, Ethan was already gone. This was not unusual. Ethan often headed out early to get a head start on the day, especially when the forecast called for heavy snow later. Marcus assumed his friend was already at the north site, a location about 2 kilometers across the frozen lake, where they had been conducting surveys for a planned expansion. The lake had been frozen solid since November. Crews drove trucks across it daily without concern. The ice was over a meter thick in most places, strong enough to support the weight of heavy machinery. Ethan knew this. He had measured the ice thickness himself just days before. That morning, he had left on foot, carrying his surveying equipment in a backpack. He wore his standard cold weather gear, insulated boots, thermal layers, a heavy parka, and a bright orange safety vest that made him visible against the white landscape. Several workers reported seeing him leave the main camp area shortly after 6 in the morning, heading toward the lake. He waved to a few of them. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. By noon, when Ethan had not returned or radioed in, his supervisor began to worry. Radio check-ins were mandatory protocol, especially when working alone in extreme conditions. The supervisor tried reaching Ethan multiple times with no response. At 1 in the afternoon, a search team was assembled. 6 men, including Marcus, headed out toward the north site to locate him. The weather had held. Visibility was good, and there was no fresh snowfall to obscure tracks. They followed the standard route across the lake, the same path everyone used. What they found approximately halfway across the lake made absolutely no sense. Ethan's footprints were clearly visible in the snow that dusted the ice surface. His gait was normal, steady, exactly what one would expect from someone walking with purpose across familiar terrain. But then, without any warning or deviation, the footprints simply stopped. Not at the edge of a crack in the ice, not near any visible disturbance. They just ended, as if Ethan had been plucked from the surface mid-stride. The search team stood there in stunned silence, looking at the last imprint of his boot. Beyond that point, nothing. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle, no holes in the ice, just pristine snow and solid ice stretching out in all directions. The team immediately checked the ice beneath where the tracks ended. They drilled test holes and found the ice to be nearly 1.5 meters thick at that exact spot. There was no possible way someone could have fallen through. Even if the ice had somehow cracked and immediately refrozen, there would have been evidence. Water displacement, disturbed snow, fracture patterns. There was nothing. They expanded their search in every direction, walking in widening circles from the point where the footprints terminated. They found no additional tracks, no sign that Ethan had wandered off course or doubled back. His footprints led from the camp, across the ice, and stopped in the middle of nowhere. By evening, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had been notified, and a full-scale search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the area. Ground teams with search dogs combed every meter of the shoreline and the surrounding forest. Divers were brought in to search beneath the ice, though everyone agreed it seemed impossible that Ethan could have gone through. Days turned into a week. The search expanded to cover over 100 square kilometers. They found nothing. Not a single piece of equipment. Not a shred of clothing. Not one additional footprint. It was as if Ethan had simply ceased to exist at that precise spot on the lake. The team did eventually reach the north site, where Ethan had been heading. His equipment was there, right where he had left it the previous day. The transit was still set up on its tripod. His field notes were in his truck, which was parked nearby. Everything was exactly as it should have been. He had clearly intended to return to that location, to continue the work he had started. But he never made it. The investigation revealed several perplexing details that deepened the mystery. Ethan's footprints measured exactly 32 centimeters in length, matching his boot size. The depth and spacing of the prints indicated a normal walking pace. Forensic analysis confirmed they were made by his specific boots based on tread pattern and wear marks. There was no evidence of any other person or vehicle in the area. No snowmobile tracks. No animal prints, nothing that could explain his disappearance. The coffee cup in his trailer was tested. It contained residue indicating he had consumed about half the contents. Toxicology reports found nothing unusual. Marcus was interviewed extensively. He confirmed that Ethan had seemed completely normal that morning. No signs of distress. No unusual behavior. No indication that anything was wrong. Ethan had not mentioned any concerns about the route or the conditions. He had simply gotten dressed, made coffee, and left to do his job, just as he had done hundreds of times before. 3 weeks after Ethan vanished, the case took an even stranger turn. A hunter named Robert Tremblay was checking his trap line approximately 40 kilometers southwest of the mining camp. The area was deep wilderness, accessible only by snowmobile or on foot. Tremblay had been trapping that region for over 20 years and knew it intimately. On the afternoon of February 8th, he was following a frozen creek bed when he saw someone standing at the edge of the tree line, about 50 meters away. The figure was motionless, facing away from him. Tremblay called out, asking if the person needed help. The figure did not respond. Tremblay called out again, louder this time. Still no response. As Tremblay approached, he got a better look. The person was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be a man of average height and build. Something about the stance seemed off, though Tremblay could not articulate exactly what bothered him. When Tremblay got within about 20 meters, he called out a third time. At that moment, the figure turned slightly. Tremblay caught a glimpse of the profile and immediately thought of the missing surveyor. The build was right. The height was right. The orange vest that Tremblay could now see under the dark outer layer was right. Tremblay shouted Ethan's name. The figure did not acknowledge him. Instead, it turned fully away and began walking backward into the forest. Not walking forward and looking back, not running. Walking backward, maintaining its orientation toward the trees while moving into them. Tremblay was experienced in the wilderness and not easily frightened, But what he witnessed made his blood run cold. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding backward between the trees without ever turning around or looking where it was going. Tremblay ran forward, crashing through the snow, desperate to catch up. When he reached the tree line, there was nothing. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. He searched for over an hour, expanding his search in every direction. He found no evidence of the figure he had seen. When he reported the incident to the RCMP, he was visibly shaken. Officers who interviewed him said Tremblay was adamant about what he had witnessed. He insisted the clothing matched the description of what Ethan had been wearing. He insisted the figure had walked backward into the forest. He insisted there were no tracks. Investigators took Tremblay seriously. They launched another search of the area where he reported the sighting. They brought in additional resources. They interviewed Tremblay multiple times to ensure his story remained consistent. It did. Every detail stayed the same. Tremblay never wavered. He maintained that he saw someone matching Ethan's description, that the person moved in an impossible manner, and that there were no tracks. Search and rescue teams spent days combing the area. They found nothing. Ethan's family was devastated. His parents traveled from their home in southern Ontario to join the search efforts. They posted flyers. They offered a reward for information. They gave interviews to local media. They did everything they could to find their son. His mother described Ethan as responsible, capable, and not someone who would take unnecessary risks. His father talked about Ethan's love for the outdoors and his respect for the dangers of the northern wilderness. They could not comprehend what had happened. Neither could anyone else. The mining company conducted its own internal investigation. They reviewed all safety protocols. They interviewed every worker who had been on site that day. They examined equipment logs and maintenance records. Everything was in order. There had been no safety violations, no equipment failures, no unusual incidents reported in the days leading up to Ethan's disappearance. The company hired private investigators to assist the RCMP. Those investigators found nothing new. As months passed, the case grew cold. Searches were scaled back. The media attention faded. Ethan's family continued to advocate for answers, but no answers came. The official file remained open, classified as a missing person case. No body was ever recovered. No additional evidence was ever found. The footprints that ended in the middle of the frozen lake remained the only tangible clue, and they explained nothing. The mining operation continued. Workers still crossed that lake daily, but there was an unspoken unease among them. Many refused to walk the route Ethan had taken. Some reported feeling watched when crossing the ice. Others claimed to see movement in their peripheral vision, only to find nothing there when they turned to look. The company eventually built a road around the lake to access the north site, officially citing efficiency. But everyone knew the real reason. Nobody wanted to walk where Ethan's footprints had ended. Robert Tremblay never trapped that area again. He told friends he could not shake the image of the figure walking backward into the trees. He said it haunted him. He said he knew, on some instinctive level, that what he had seen was not entirely human. Other trappers and hunters began reporting strange occurrences in that region. Sounds that did not match any known animal. Tracks that appeared and disappeared without explanation. A general sense of wrongness that permeated the forest. Ethan's case has been featured in several databases of missing persons in Canada. It has been analyzed by search and rescue experts who cannot explain what happened. The lack of evidence is what makes it so disturbing. In most disappearances, there are clues, a direction of travel, disturbed vegetation, something. In Ethan's case, there is only absence. The footprints led nowhere because there was nowhere for them to lead. He was there, and then he was not. His family still hopes for answers. They still search for closure. But as the years pass, hope fades. The wilderness of northern Ontario is vast and unforgiving. It keeps its secrets well. Whatever happened to Ethan on that frozen lake in January 2018 remains one of those secrets. The official investigation is still open. The RCMP file still sits on a desk somewhere, waiting for a break that may never come. And somewhere in the frozen north, Ethan's last footprints remain etched in the collective memory of everyone who searched for him. A haunting reminder that sometimes people simply vanish without explanation, without trace, without reason. Olivia was a beloved elementary school teacher in a small prairie town in southern Saskatchewan called Maple Creek, a community of fewer than 2,000 people where everyone knew everyone else. She had lived there for 8 years, moving from Regina after graduating from university in 1987. At 32 years old, she was known for her dedication to her students and her involvement in local community events. She sang in the church choir, volunteered at the library, and spent her summers tending to a large vegetable garden behind her farmhouse. The farmhouse itself was located about 15 kilometers outside town on a gravel road that saw little traffic. It was an older structure built in the 1940s, with a full basement and a wraparound porch that Olivia had carefully restored over the years. She lived alone, which was not unusual for the area. Many people valued the solitude and peace that came with rural prairie life. November 14th, 1995 was a cold Wednesday evening. The first significant snowfall of the season had arrived the previous night, blanketing the landscape in white. Olivia had spent the day teaching her 4th grade class and had stayed late to prepare materials for the following week. Her colleagues remembered her being in good spirits when she left the school around 5:30 in the evening. She drove home in her blue Chevrolet pickup truck, stopping briefly at the local grocery store to pick up supplies. The store clerk recalled serving her around 6 o'clock. Olivia purchased milk, bread, and canned soup. She seemed perfectly normal, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and mentioning she planned to spend the evening grading papers. Olivia arrived home sometime between 6:15 and 6:30. Her nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived approximately 3 kilometers away and did not see or hear anything unusual that evening. At exactly 8:47 in the evening, Olivia called 911. The recording of that call still exists in the police archives. Her voice was calm at first, almost too calm, as if she were trying to maintain control despite obvious fear. She reported that someone was trying to break into her basement. The dispatcher asked her to describe what she was hearing. Olivia said she could hear scratching sounds on the basement door, the one that led from the outside directly into the lower level of the house. She said the scratching had been going on for about 10 minutes and was getting more insistent. The dispatcher asked if she had seen anyone outside. Olivia said no. She said all the curtains were closed and she did not want to look out the windows. The dispatcher asked if she had locked all the doors. Olivia confirmed that she had. She said she always locked everything when she got home because being alone in such an isolated location made her cautious. The dispatcher tried to keep Olivia talking, telling her that officers were on their way and would arrive within 20 minutes. Maple Creek had only 3 patrol officers on duty at any given time, and both available units were dispatched immediately. The nearest RCMP detachment was in the town, and the drive to Olivia's farmhouse took approximately 15 minutes under normal conditions. As the dispatcher continued talking to Olivia, the tone of the conversation changed. Olivia's breathing became more rapid. She said the scratching had stopped. There was silence for approximately 5 seconds. Then Olivia said something was now in the basement. The dispatcher asked how she knew. Olivia said she could hear footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. The dispatcher urged her to leave the house immediately, to go out the front door and get in her truck. Olivia said she could not. She said the basement door was right at the bottom of the main staircase, and she would have to pass it to reach the front entrance. She said she was upstairs in her bedroom with the door locked. The dispatcher asked if there was another way out. Olivia said there was a window in the bedroom that led to the porch roof. She could climb down from there. The dispatcher told her to do that, to get out and drive away. There was another pause. Then Olivia said the footsteps had stopped. She said everything was quiet. The dispatcher told her this was the time to move, to get out while she could. Olivia agreed. The sound on the recording indicated she was moving, opening the window. There was the creak of old hinges, the rustle of movement. Then Olivia made a sound, a sharp intake of breath. The dispatcher asked what was wrong. Olivia did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was hollow, distant. She said someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her bedroom door. The dispatcher asked how she knew if her door was locked and she was inside. Olivia said she could see through the gap at the bottom of the door. She said she could see shoes, men's work boots, standing perfectly still. The dispatcher told her again to leave through the window. Olivia said she was going to. The recording captured the sound of her moving toward the window. Then there was a loud crash, the sound of wood splintering. Olivia screamed. The dispatcher called her name repeatedly. There was chaos on the line, sounds of struggle, something hitting the floor. Then the call disconnected. The officers arrived at Olivia's farmhouse at 9:14, approximately 27 minutes after the initial call. The property was dark except for a single light visible in an upstairs window. The officers approached cautiously with weapons drawn. The front door was unlocked. They announced their presence and entered. The interior of the house was neat and orderly. There were no signs of disturbance in the living room or kitchen. The basement door, located just off the main hallway, was closed. The officers proceeded upstairs to the bedroom, where Olivia had made the call. The door to that room was off its hinges, lying on the floor inside the room. The wood around the lock was splintered, indicating significant force had been used to break it open. Olivia was in the basement. The officers found her body at the bottom of the basement stairs. She was lying on her back, arms at her sides, as if she had been carefully placed there. Her eyes were open. There was no blood, no visible injuries, no signs of trauma. The officers checked for a pulse and found none. Emergency medical services were called. Paramedics arrived and confirmed that Olivia was deceased. The coroner was notified. An investigation was immediately launched. The forensic examination of Olivia's body revealed no cause of death. There were no wounds, no bruising consistent with strangulation or suffocation, no signs of poisoning. Toxicology tests came back negative for drugs or alcohol. The autopsy concluded that Olivia's heart had simply stopped, but there was no medical reason for cardiac arrest in an otherwise healthy 32-year-old woman. The coroner listed the cause of death as undetermined. The condition of the body indicated she had been dead for less than an hour when the officers found her, consistent with the timeline of the 911 call. The investigation of the scene produced more questions than answers. The basement door that Olivia had reported someone scratching on showed marks on the exterior surface. Deep gouges in the wood, as if made by fingernails or some kind of tool. The marks were fresh. Paint chips were still on the ground beneath the door. However, the door was locked from the inside, secured with a deadbolt that could only be engaged from within the basement. There was no way someone could have locked it from the outside. The basement itself was cluttered with stored items, boxes, old furniture, and miscellaneous household goods. There was no indication that anyone had disturbed anything, no footprints in the dust, no displaced items, nothing to suggest an intruder had been present. The bedroom door had been forced open with tremendous strength. The wood around the lock was not just cracked, but shattered. Investigators determined that the force required would be consistent with someone kicking the door or ramming it with significant body weight multiple times. Yet Olivia's 911 call lasted less than 3 minutes from the time she reported someone in the house to the moment the call disconnected. That seemed like insufficient time for someone to break through such a solid door, overpower Olivia, carry her down 2 flights of stairs, and position her body in the basement, all while leaving no forensic evidence. The phone line at Olivia's house was examined. Investigators discovered that the exterior phone line had been cut approximately 6 meters from where it connected to the house. The cut was clean, made with a sharp tool, likely wire cutters. The phone company was brought in to analyze the situation. They confirmed that the line had been severed. However, the timestamp on the 911 call indicated Olivia made the call at 8:47. The phone company determined that based on the condition of the cut line and the environmental factors, the line had been severed no later than 8:30. That meant the phone line had been cut at least 15 minutes before Olivia called 911. The phone company insisted this was impossible. A severed line could not transmit a call. Yet the call existed. The recording existed. The dispatcher had logged it. The officers had responded to it. The investigation expanded. Officers interviewed everyone in the area. The Hendersons, Olivia's nearest neighbors, reported seeing nothing unusual. They had been home all evening watching television and heard no vehicles pass by on the gravel road. Other residents within a 10-kilometer radius were contacted. No one reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles or strangers in the area. Olivia's truck was parked in its usual spot beside the house, undisturbed. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her wallet contained cash and credit cards. Nothing had been stolen. There was no evidence of robbery or sexual assault. Detectives looked into Olivia's personal life. They interviewed her family, friends, and colleagues. Everyone described her as kind, responsible, and well-liked. She had no known enemies, no recent conflicts, no romantic relationships that had ended badly. Her financial records showed no irregularities. Her phone records revealed no threatening calls. Her mail contained no disturbing letters. Every aspect of her life appeared completely normal. There was no reason anyone would want to harm her. There was no indication she had been targeted. The case attracted attention from forensic specialists and criminal psychologists. Some theorized that Olivia had experienced a sudden cardiac event unrelated to an intruder, and that the 911 call was a result of hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation to her brain. This theory failed to explain the forced door, the cut phone line, or the scratches on the basement door. Others suggested Olivia had staged the call herself as part of a mental health crisis, but there was no history of mental illness, and her behavior leading up to that evening had been entirely normal. The scratches on the basement door were analyzed. The depth and pattern were consistent with human fingernails, but the force required to create such deep gouges would have resulted in severe damage to the person's fingers. No blood or tissue was found on the door. Months passed. The investigation continued but produced no breaks. In early 1996, the case was classified as a suspicious death with undetermined circumstances. The file remained open, but active investigative work ceased. Olivia's family was devastated. They pushed for answers, hiring private investigators, consulting with experts, doing everything they could to understand what had happened. The private investigators reached the same dead ends as the police. The case defied logical explanation. In late 1997, a development occurred that deepened the mystery. The Henderson family, who had lived on their farm for over 30 years, abruptly moved away. When asked why, Mrs. Henderson was reluctant to provide details. Eventually, under pressure from investigators who wondered if the family knew something relevant to Olivia's case, Mrs. Henderson revealed that they had been experiencing disturbing events. She said they heard scratching on their basement door late at night. She said their dogs refused to go near certain areas of their property. She said her husband had seen someone standing at the edge of their field on multiple occasions, always at dusk, always motionless. When he approached, the figure would disappear. The Hendersons did not believe these events were coincidental. They believed something was wrong with the area. They left and never returned. Other families in the surrounding region began reporting similar experiences: unexplained sounds, feelings of being watched, animals behaving strangely. Some dismissed these reports as hysteria fueled by knowledge of Olivia's unsolved death. Others took them seriously. The RCMP investigated several of these reports, but found no evidence of criminal activity. By 1998, the case had gone cold. No new leads emerged. The physical evidence offered no additional insights. Olivia's family held a memorial service and tried to find closure, though they never stopped hoping for answers. To this day, the death of Olivia remains officially unsolved. The case file is stored in the RCMP archives in Regina. Occasionally, a new investigator will review it, hoping fresh eyes might see something previous detectives missed. So far, no one has. The farmhouse where Olivia died was eventually sold. The new owners experienced no unusual incidents and lived there for several years before moving for unrelated reasons. The property has changed hands multiple times since then. Some owners reported odd occurrences, others did not. The inconsistency makes it difficult to draw conclusions. What is certain is that on the evening of November the 14th, 1995, something happened in that farmhouse that defies conventional explanation. Olivia made a call on a phone line that had been cut. She described an intruder whose presence left no physical evidence. She died without apparent cause. Her body was moved to the basement by someone or something that left no trace. The case remains one of Saskatchewan's most baffling unsolved mysteries. A reminder that sometimes the answers we seek are simply not available, no matter how thoroughly we search. Mason was a construction worker from Terrace, British Columbia, a town of about 11,000 people situated in the northwestern part of the province. He had spent most of his adult life working on renovation projects throughout the region, from residential homes to commercial buildings. He was known for his reliability, his attention to detail, and his ability to tackle challenging projects that others avoided. In the spring of 2003, when he was 34 years old, Mason was hired by a consortium of local churches to renovate an old Anglican church that had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. The church was located on the outskirts of Kitimat, approximately 45 kilometers south of Terrace. It was a modest structure built in 1947 to serve a small logging community that had thrived briefly after World War II, before declining as the timber industry contracted. By the mid-1980s, the congregation had dwindled to just a handful of elderly parishioners. When the last minister retired in 1984, the church was officially decommissioned. It had sat empty ever since, slowly deteriorating under the relentless assault of coastal weather. The building's white paint had peeled away in long strips. The roof leaked in multiple places. Windows were broken. Vegetation had begun to reclaim the property, with blackberry bushes and wild ferns growing up against the walls. The church consortium that purchased the property in 2002 planned to restore it and reopen it as a community center serving the scattered rural population in the area. They hired Mason to oversee the structural assessment and initial demolition work. The budget was limited, so Mason worked mostly alone, with occasional help from a day laborer when heavy lifting was required. He began the project on April 7, 2003. The first day was spent documenting the building's condition, taking measurements, and planning the renovation sequence. The second day, April 8th, Mason arrived at the site at 7 in the morning to begin removing damaged interior elements. The church interior was typical of rural religious buildings from that era. There were rows of simple wooden pews facing a raised altar area. The walls were bare except for water stains and patches of mold. A small office and storage room were located behind the sanctuary. Mason's plan was to start by removing the pews, which were unsalvageable due to rot and insect damage. He worked methodically, using a crowbar and hammer to disassemble the seating. By mid-morning, he had cleared about half the pews and stacked the wood outside for disposal. Around 11, Mason moved to the altar area to assess the platform and the decorative elements. The altar itself was a simple wooden structure, painted white but now grimy and discolored. Behind it stood a tall wooden cross affixed to the wall. Mason examined the wall, tapping it in several places to check for structural issues. As he worked his way along the section behind the altar, he noticed something unusual. The wall sounded hollow in one specific area, approximately 2 meters wide and extending from floor to ceiling. Mason knocked on the wall in adjacent areas. Those sections sounded solid, but this one spot definitely had a void behind it. He examined the wall more closely. The paneling in this section was slightly different from the rest. It was newer, perhaps installed in the 1970s or 80s based on the style and materials. Mason used his crowbar to pry away a section of the paneling. Behind it was not the original wall, but rather a crude framework of 2x4s, creating a false barrier. Someone had deliberately built a partition to seal off a space. Mason felt a flicker of unease, but continued. Renovation work often revealed odd modifications made by previous occupants. Churches, especially, tended to accumulate strange alterations over decades of use. He removed more paneling, creating an opening large enough to see into the space beyond. Using a flashlight, Mason peered through. What he saw made his stomach turn. The hidden room was small, perhaps 3 meters square. The floor was bare concrete, and arranged in perfect concentric circles on that floor were dozens of children's shoes. Small shoes, toddler-sized, to perhaps age 10 or 12. They were old, the styles dating back decades. Some were leather, others canvas. All were dusty and faded, but remarkably well preserved given their age. The arrangement was deliberate and precise. 3 circles, one inside the next, with each shoe placed carefully with the toes pointing toward the center. Mason stepped back from the opening, his heart pounding. This was not normal. This was deeply wrong. He pulled out his cell phone to call the police, but realized he had no signal. Cell coverage in this area was spotty at best. He would need to drive to find a phone, but something compelled him to look more closely first. He widened the opening enough to step through into the hidden room. The air inside was stale and smelled faintly of mildew. Mason swept his flashlight around the space. The walls were bare concrete. There was nothing else in the room except the shoes. He crouched down to examine them, without touching anything. Some of the shoes had faded writing inside. Names. He could make out a few. Tommy, Sarah, Jennifer, Michael. Mason felt his skin crawl. He stood and was about to leave when his flashlight beam caught something he had missed. In the far corner of the room, partially obscured by shadow, there was a loose section of concrete flooring. It looked like a patch job, newer than the surrounding floor. Mason approached it and knelt down. Using his fingers, he pried at the edge of the concrete patch. It came up easily, revealing that it was not actually secured but simply placed over a hole. Beneath it was dirt, and partially buried in that dirt were items of clothing. Small items. Children's clothing. A faded red shirt. A tiny pair of blue jeans. A yellow dress. Mason immediately left the room. He did not touch anything else. He walked quickly out of the church to his truck and drove directly to the nearest payphone at a gas station 3 kilometers away. He called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and reported what he had found. The dispatcher took his information and assured him officers would respond immediately. Mason drove back to the church and waited outside, unwilling to go back inside alone. Within 40 minutes, 2 RCMP officers arrived. Mason explained what he had discovered and led them into the church. The officers examined the hidden room and immediately called for additional resources. By late afternoon, a forensic team had arrived from Prince Rupert. The site was secured as a potential crime scene. Mason was interviewed at length. He described exactly what he had done, what he had found, and confirmed that he had not disturbed anything beyond the initial discovery. Investigators photographed the room extensively before removing the shoes one by one. Each shoe was cataloged and bagged as evidence. The names inside were noted. The clothing items beneath the concrete patch were carefully excavated. A forensic anthropologist was brought in to determine if there were human remains buried on the property. Over the next week, the investigation expanded dramatically. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the entire church property. Several anomalies were detected, indicating possible burial sites. Excavation began. Investigators worked methodically, removing soil layer by layer. They found more clothing buried in shallow pits around the church. They found personal items, a child's hairbrush, a small toy car, a tarnished locket. But they did not find bodies, no skeletal remains, no physical evidence of the children themselves, just their belongings carefully buried and hidden. The shoes and clothing were analyzed by forensic experts. The items dated from approximately 1950 to 1970 based on manufacturing details and style. DNA testing was attempted on the clothing, but the samples were too degraded to yield useful results. Investigators cross-referenced the names found inside the shoes with missing persons cases from that time period. They focused on the region around Kitimat and Terrace, but expanded to include all of northwestern British Columbia. What they discovered was deeply disturbing. 7 of the names matched children who had been reported missing between 1950 and 1970. These were cases that had never been solved. Children who had vanished from small towns and logging camps scattered across the region. Some had disappeared while playing near their homes. Others had gone missing on their way to or from school. In every case, no trace of the child had ever been found. No witnesses, no leads. The cases had gone cold decades ago, and now their shoes and clothing had been discovered hidden in a church. Investigators obtained records from the Anglican diocese regarding the church's history. They identified every minister, caretaker, and volunteer who had been associated with the building. One name stood out. Reverend Thomas Ashford had served as the minister from 1948 until his sudden departure in 1971. Church records indicated he had resigned without explanation and moved away from the area. The diocese had no forwarding address for him. Investigators traced his movements through various public records. Ashford had relocated to Alberta in 1971, worked briefly at a church in Red Deer, then disappeared from official records entirely. A death certificate was eventually located. Thomas Ashford had died in 1982 in a small town in Manitoba. He had been living under a slightly different name, Thomas Ash, working as a janitor at a school. Investigators tried to build a case against Ashford posthumously. They interviewed people who had known him during his time in Kitimat. Descriptions were consistent. He was remembered as a quiet, reserved man who kept to himself. He had organized youth programs at the church and spent considerable time with children from the community. Several people recalled that he had seemed overly interested in troubled or isolated children, offering to mentor them or provide guidance. But no one had suspected anything inappropriate at the time. Church attendance records showed that several of the missing children had attended services at his church. This was not conclusive evidence, as the church served a wide area and many families attended, but it was suggestive. The investigation hit numerous dead ends. Without bodies, without witnesses, without physical evidence directly linking Ashford to the disappearances, prosecutors determined there was insufficient evidence to definitively conclude he had been responsible for any crimes. The hidden room and the buried belongings were deeply suspicious, but they did not constitute proof of murder. It was possible, prosecutors acknowledged, that Ashford had been involved in the disappearances. It was equally possible he had collected the items for reasons that were disturbing, but not necessarily criminal. Perhaps he had found the items. Perhaps he had a psychological compulsion to keep mementos of tragic events. The legal standard for charging someone, even posthumously, required proof beyond reasonable doubt. That standard could not be met. The families of the 7 missing children were contacted. Most of the parents had passed away by 2003, but siblings, cousins, and extended family members were located and informed of the discovery. For them, it provided a terrible sort of closure. Their loved ones had not simply vanished. Something had happened to them. Someone had taken their belongings and hidden them. While the bodies were never recovered, The families could at least acknowledge that the children had almost certainly been victims of foul play rather than accidents or runaways. Memorial services were held. The shoes and clothing, after being held as evidence, were eventually returned to the families. The church renovation project was permanently canceled. The building was declared a site of historical significance related to an ongoing investigation and was sealed. It remains standing today, though access is restricted. The property is surrounded by a chain-link fence with no trespassing signs. Local residents avoid the area. Stories about the church have become part of regional folklore. Some claim to have seen lights inside the building at night. Others report hearing children's voices near the property. These accounts are dismissed by authorities as local legend, but they persist. Mason completed his interview obligations with investigators and returned to his regular work. He refused all media requests for interviews. The discovery had profoundly affected him. Friends said he became withdrawn and anxious. He had trouble sleeping. He would not take renovation jobs that involved old churches or abandoned buildings. In 2005, Mason moved to Vancouver Island, seeking distance from the region and the memories associated with the case. He rarely discussed what he had found, even with close friends. The case officially remains unsolved. The RCMP file is still active, though no new leads have emerged in over 20 years. Advances in forensic technology have allowed investigators to periodically re-examine the evidence, but degraded samples and the passage of time have limited what can be learned. The identities of the other children, whose shoes and belongings were found in the hidden room, have never been determined. The names inside those shoes did not match any known missing persons cases. It is possible those children were never reported missing. It is possible they came from transient families working in logging camps who moved frequently. Or it is possible their disappearances were simply never documented in a way that created lasting records. The discovery Mason made in that abandoned church remains one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in British Columbia history. The deliberate concealment of children's belongings, the careful arrangement in ritualistic patterns, the complete absence of the children themselves. These elements combine to create a mystery that haunts everyone who encounters it. 7 families received partial answers about what happened to their children, but those answers only generated more terrible questions. Where are the bodies? What exactly happened to those children? Were there other victims whose disappearances were never documented? And why did Thomas Ashford, if he was indeed responsible, hide evidence rather than destroy it? Was it guilt? Was it obsession? Was it something darker? These questions will likely never be answered. The truth died with Ashford in 1982, leaving behind only the silent testimony of shoes arranged in circles on a concrete floor in a hidden room behind an altar. Ava was a marine biologist working for Memorial University of Newfoundland, conducting research on North Atlantic right whale migration patterns off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. At 29 years old, she had already established herself as a dedicated researcher with a particular interest in marine mammal behavior and conservation. She had grown up in St. John's and spent her childhood fascinated by the ocean, eventually earning her doctorate in marine biology from Dalhousie University in Halifax before returning home to continue her research. In the summer of 2010, she was participating in a multi-year study tracking whale populations along the eastern coast of Canada, focusing particularly on the waters around Fogo Island. Fogo Island sits off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, a remote location known for its rugged beauty and rich fishing history. The island has a permanent population of around 2,000 people spread across several small communities. The waters surrounding Fogo Island are deep and cold, part of the Labrador Current system that brings Arctic water south along the coast. These waters are rich in marine life, making them ideal feeding grounds for various whale species. Ava had been working from a research station on the island for 3 weeks, making daily trips out on the water to observe and document whale activity. On July 22, 2010, Ava departed from the research station dock at approximately 6 in the morning. She was alone in a 22-foot Boston whaler equipped with research equipment, including hydrophones for recording underwater sounds, cameras for documentation, and GPS tracking devices. Solo trips were standard procedure for researchers at her experience level, and the weather forecast was favorable with calm seas and good visibility. She radioed the station at 6:45, confirming she was heading to a location approximately 18 kilometers northeast of the island, where she had documented significant whale activity the previous day. At 9:32 in the morning, Ava made another radio transmission to the research station. The communications officer on duty, a graduate student named Michael Chen, recorded the details of the call. Ava reported that she was observing unusual activity in the water. She described seeing large disturbances beneath the surface, much larger than would be consistent with the right whales she had been tracking. Chen asked her to clarify what she meant by unusual. Ava said the movements were too fast and too coordinated. She said whatever was creating the disturbances was circling her boat in patterns that did not match any known whale behavior. Chen asked if she wanted to return to the station. Ava said no, that she wanted to document what she was seeing because it was unlike anything she had encountered before. At 10:03, Ava radioed again. Her voice was different this time. Chen later described it as strained, as if she were trying to remain calm while experiencing significant stress. She reported that the activity had intensified. She said there were multiple large objects moving beneath her boat. She said her hydrophones were picking up sounds that did not match any cataloged marine mammal vocalizations. Chen asked her to describe the sounds. Ava said they were low frequency, almost like mechanical tones, but with variations that suggested biological origin. She said they were getting louder. Chen again suggested she return to the station immediately. Ava agreed. She said she was starting the engine and heading back. At 10:11, Ava made her final transmission. The recording of this call has been analyzed extensively by investigators and remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the case. Ava's voice was panicked. She said something was wrong. She said the objects beneath the water were surfacing. Chen asked what she was seeing. Ava did not respond directly to the question. Instead, she said they were not whales. She repeated this twice. They are not whales. They are not whales. Chen asked what they were. Ava began to say something, but her words were cut off by a sound. The best way Chen could describe it later was as screaming, but not human screaming. A high-pitched, sustained noise that hurt to hear, even through the radio. The transmission ended abruptly. The research station immediately attempted to re-establish contact with Ava. There was no response. The station director initiated emergency protocols. The Canadian Coast Guard was notified at 10:23. A search and rescue operation was launched within 30 minutes. Coast Guard vessels and a helicopter were dispatched to Ava's last known position based on her GPS coordinates. The weather remained good and visibility was excellent. By noon, search crews had reached the area where Ava had been working. They found her boat at approximately 12:40 in the afternoon. It was adrift, engine running, floating freely about 2 kilometers from where her last GPS position had been recorded. The boat was undamaged. All equipment was intact and functioning. Ava's research notes were on the seat, secured under a clipboard. Her water bottle was in the cup holder, still half full. Her waterproof jacket was draped over the captain's chair. But Ava was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere on the vessel. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. The Coast Guard conducted an extensive search of the surrounding waters. Divers were deployed to search beneath the surface in the immediate area where the boat was found. Helicopters flew search patterns, covering hundreds of square kilometers. The search continued for 5 days, involving multiple vessels and dozens of personnel. No trace of Ava was found. No body, no clothing, no equipment from her person. She had simply vanished. The investigation that followed examined every aspect of the incident. Ava's boat was towed back to port and subjected to forensic analysis. Investigators confirmed that the engine had been running when the Coast Guard found it, and there was sufficient fuel remaining for several more hours of operation. The kill switch, which would shut off the engine if someone fell overboard, had not been activated. This was unusual because Ava would have been wearing the kill switch lanyard attached to her life jacket, as was standard safety protocol. The life jacket was found on the boat, properly stowed. Ava had removed it at some point, which violated safety procedures. The research equipment on the boat was examined. Ava's cameras had been running and captured footage up until approximately 10:05. The final minutes of footage showed the water surface. The video quality was good and the sea conditions were calm, but the footage revealed something unexpected. In the final 7 photographs taken by the still camera, which was set to capture images at 30-second intervals, something appeared beneath the water. The images were not clear enough to identify specific shapes, but they showed large dark masses just under the surface. Analysis indicated these masses were within 50 meters of the boat. Marine biologists who reviewed the footage could not identify what they were. The shapes were too large and moved too quickly to be right whales. They did not match the profile of any known species in those waters. The hydrophone recordings from Ava's equipment were analyzed by acoustics experts. The sounds captured in the final minutes of recording were unlike anything in the marine mammal database. The frequency range was consistent with biological sounds, but the patterns did not match whales, dolphins, or any cataloged species. Some experts suggested the sounds could be mechanical, perhaps from a submarine or underwater vehicle, but military officials confirmed no naval operations were being conducted in that area at that time. The sounds remained unexplained. Investigators interviewed everyone at the research station. Michael Chen was questioned extensively about the radio transmissions. His account never wavered. He insisted that Ava had been genuinely frightened during her final call. Other researchers confirmed that Ava was experienced, level-headed, and not prone to exaggeration or panic. She would not have reported unusual activity unless she truly believed something extraordinary was occurring. Her academic record and previous research demonstrated her credibility and scientific rigor. The university conducted its own internal review of the incident. They examined safety protocols and determined that Ava had followed all standard procedures up until the point she removed her life jacket. Why she removed it remains unknown. Some theorized she may have been preparing to enter the water, perhaps to deploy equipment or to investigate something more closely. Others suggested she may have removed it in a moment of panic, though this seemed inconsistent with her training and experience. The review concluded that the cause of Ava's disappearance could not be determined based on available evidence. The case attracted attention from various groups interested in unexplained phenomena. UFO researchers suggested Ava had encountered something extraterrestrial. Cryptozoology enthusiasts proposed she had discovered an unknown marine species. Skeptics argued that Ava had likely fallen overboard and drowned, and that the unusual sounds and shapes were misinterpretations of ordinary phenomena. None of these theories adequately explained all the evidence. The underwater shapes in the photographs, the unidentified sounds, the inhuman screaming captured on the radio transmission, Ava's complete disappearance without any physical evidence. Local fishermen from Fogo Island were interviewed. Several reported experiencing strange occurrences in the waters northeast of the island over the years. Stories of unusual lights beneath the surface. Accounts of fishing equipment being pulled down with tremendous force. Reports of sounds underwater that frightened marine animals. These accounts had been dismissed as folklore or exaggeration, but in the context of Ava's disappearance, they took on new significance. Investigators documented these reports but could not substantiate them with physical evidence. In the months following the incident, other researchers working in the area reported feeling uneasy about conducting fieldwork in the same location where Ava disappeared. Some refused to go there alone. The research station modified its protocols to require all solo boat trips to be accompanied by a second vessel within visual range. The university increased safety requirements and installed additional tracking and communication equipment on all research vessels. But these measures could not address the fundamental mystery of what happened to Ava. Her family was devastated. Her parents traveled to Fogo Island multiple times, meeting with investigators and participating in search efforts. They established a scholarship in her name at Memorial University to support marine biology students. They gave interviews to media outlets, hoping publicity might generate new information. Nothing came of it. As years passed, the case grew cold. The official status remained listed as a missing person case. No body was ever recovered. No additional evidence emerged. In 2015, 5 years after Ava's disappearance, a fishing vessel operating in the same general area where she vanished reported a similar experience. The crew described seeing large shapes moving beneath their boat and hearing unusual sounds through the hull. They immediately returned to port and reported the incident to authorities. An investigation was conducted, but nothing concrete was found. The fishing crew's account was documented, but added little to the understanding of what might have happened to Ava. The case remains one of Newfoundland's most perplexing unsolved mysteries. Ava was an experienced researcher working in familiar waters under good conditions. She disappeared in broad daylight while in radio contact with her research station. Her boat was found intact, with all equipment functioning. The evidence suggests she encountered something in the water that frightened her enough to violate safety protocols and ultimately led to her disappearance. But what that something was remains completely unknown. The photographs showing shapes beneath the water, the unidentified acoustic recordings, the terrifying sound captured during her final transmission. These pieces of evidence point toward something extraordinary, but they provide no definitive answers. Ava's family continues to hope for information that might explain what happened. The research community remembers her as a talented scientist whose work contributed significantly to marine conservation, and the waters northeast of Fogo Island remain a place where fishermen and researchers alike feel a lingering sense of unease, wondering what might be moving in the depths below. Liam was a 26-year-old security guard hired by a demolition company in Brandon, Manitoba in the fall of 2015. He had worked various security positions since finishing high school, mostly at construction sites and commercial properties. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward, and he appreciated the solitude of night shifts. In late September, he was assigned to a new contract that would last approximately 3 months. His job was to prevent trespassers from entering an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the city that had been scheduled for demolition. The building had a reputation among local teenagers as a place to explore, and the demolition company wanted to ensure no one was injured or caused damage before the structure could be safely torn down. The Brandon Provincial Mental Health Center had been built in 1891 and operated continuously until its closure in 2012. At its peak, in the mid-20th century, the facility housed over 400 patients and employed dozens of staff. By the time it closed, only a small wing remained operational, housing fewer than 30 patients who were transferred to newer facilities when the government decided the aging structure was too costly to maintain and renovate. The building sat empty for 3 years before a development company purchased the property with plans to construct a residential complex on the site. Demolition was scheduled to begin in January 2016, but until then, someone needed to watch the place. Liam started his assignment on September 28, 2015. His shift ran from 8 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 5 nights per week. The hospital was a sprawling 3-story brick structure with multiple wings radiating from a central hub. Most of the building was above ground, but there was an extensive basement level that had housed utility systems, storage areas, and various support facilities. Liam was provided with a small office near the main entrance where he could monitor security cameras, complete paperwork, and stay warm during his shift. He was instructed to conduct hourly patrols of the building's perimeter and to check the main doors to ensure they remained locked. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The building was eerie but unremarkable. Empty hallways, peeling paint, the smell of mildew and decay. Liam walked his patrols, checked the doors, and spent the rest of his time reading in the office. On his 3rd night, October 1st, something changed. At approximately 11:30 in the evening, while sitting in the office, Liam heard a sound from somewhere deep in the building. It was faint but distinct. Singing. Children singing. The sound was muffled, as if coming from far away or through thick walls. Liam froze, listening carefully. The singing continued for perhaps 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. Liam grabbed his flashlight and radio and went to investigate. He walked through the ground floor hallways, listening at doorways, trying to locate the source of the sound. He heard nothing. The building was silent except for the ambient creaks and groans of an old structure settling. He checked every room accessible from the main corridor. All were empty. He returned to the office, unsettled but trying to rationalize what he had heard. Perhaps it had been the wind moving through broken windows. Perhaps it had been his imagination. He tried to dismiss it. An hour later, at 12:30, he heard it again. This time he was certain. Children singing, multiple voices. The melody was unclear, but the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from below him, from the basement. Liam had been told the basement was off limits except for emergency situations. The lighting was poor down there, and much of the area was cluttered with old equipment and debris. But he needed to investigate. He could not ignore what he was hearing. He located the basement access door near the central stairwell, unlocked it, and descended the stairs. The basement was dark and cold. His flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating concrete walls and old pipes running along the ceiling. The air smelled of dampness and rust. Liam moved slowly, calling out to announce his presence in case someone had broken in. There was no response. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a long corridor with doors on both sides. Some doors were open, revealing storage rooms filled with discarded furniture and equipment. Other doors were closed. He tried several. Most were unlocked and open to reveal empty rooms. As he progressed down the corridor, he noticed something unusual. Papers were scattered across the floor in increasing density. He stopped and crouched down to examine them. They were patient files, old medical records. He picked one up and shone his light on it. The document was dated 1967 and detailed the treatment of a patient named Sarah, age 12, admitted for behavioral issues. Liam looked at another file. This one was from 1964, a patient named Michael, age 9. He stood and scanned the floor with his light. There were dozens of files scattered everywhere, all related to children who had been patients at the facility decades ago. Liam felt a growing sense of unease. Why were these files here in the basement, scattered across the floor? They should have been stored properly or destroyed according to privacy regulations when the facility closed. He continued down the corridor, now more alert to his surroundings. At the end of the hallway, he found a door that was different from the others. It was made of heavy metal, painted institutional green, with a small reinforced window at eye level. The door had a serious lock mechanism, the kind used for secure areas. Liam tried the handle. It was locked. He peered through the window, but could see nothing in the darkness beyond. He decided to report what he had found. He returned to his office and called his supervisor, leaving a message describing the scattered patient files and asking for instructions. His supervisor called back 20 minutes later and told him to stay out of the basement unless absolutely necessary. The company was aware the building contained old records, and a team would be sent to properly secure and dispose of them before demolition. Liam was relieved to have an explanation, however unsatisfying. The next night, October 2nd, Liam arrived for his shift determined to stay out of the basement. He conducted his perimeter patrols and settled into the office. At 10:45, he heard the singing again. This time it was louder, more distinct. He could almost make out words. The sound was definitely coming from the basement. He tried to ignore it, following his supervisor's instructions, but the singing continued, growing louder over the course of an hour. By midnight, Liam could no longer tolerate the sound. He had to go down there again. He descended to the basement and followed the corridor to the locked green door. The singing was coming from behind it. He was certain now. He put his ear to the metal surface and listened. Children's voices, multiple children singing in unison. The melody was slow and mournful. Liam banged on the door and shouted, demanding whoever was inside to identify themselves. The singing stopped immediately. Silence. He waited. Nothing. He banged again. No response. He tried to see through the window, but it was too dark inside. Liam returned to the office and called his supervisor again, this time insisting that someone was in the building. His supervisor was skeptical, but agreed to send someone to check in the morning. Liam spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every sound. The singing did not resume. When his replacement arrived at 6 in the morning, Liam explained everything that had happened. The day shift guard was dismissive, suggesting Liam had let the creepy atmosphere get to him. That afternoon, Liam's supervisor arrived with a maintenance worker who had keys to every door in the building. They went to the basement together and opened the locked green door. Behind it was a large room, perhaps 20 meters square. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was bare concrete. The room was completely empty except for old restraints still mounted to the walls. Heavy leather straps and metal cuffs designed to secure people. The sight made Liam's stomach turn. This had clearly been a room used for patient restraint, a practice that had been common in psychiatric facilities decades ago, but was now considered inhumane. The supervisor explained that the room had been part of the old secure ward, where patients deemed dangerous to themselves or others had been housed. It had been out of use since the 1980s when treatment methods changed. There was nothing else in the room, no equipment, no furniture, certainly no children. The supervisor suggested that sounds could travel, strangely through old buildings, and what Liam had heard was probably coming from somewhere else and echoing down to the basement. Liam was not convinced, but had no evidence to contradict the explanation. He continued his shifts, but the singing did not stop. Over the following weeks, he heard it regularly, always emanating from the basement. He stopped investigating, instead choosing to stay in the office with the door closed. But on the night of October 18th, something happened that changed everything. Liam was conducting a late-night patrol around midnight when he passed by the main staircase leading to the upper floors. He heard footsteps above him. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the second floor. He stopped and listened. The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the building toward the center. Liam called out, announcing his presence. The footsteps stopped. He waited, then heard them resume, now moving faster. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his flashlight beam sweeping the hallway. Nothing. He walked down the corridor, checking each room, all empty. He reached the area where he had heard the footsteps and noticed a door he had not seen before. It was set back in an alcove, easy to miss. The door was slightly ajar. Liam approached cautiously and pushed it open. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading up. He climbed the stairs and found himself in the attic space, a large open area running the length of the building. The space was filled with old equipment, boxes, and miscellaneous storage items. As Liam's light swept across the attic, he saw something that made him stop breathing. A figure standing at the far end of the space, partially obscured by shadows. The figure was small, perhaps the size of a child. It was motionless. Liam shouted, identifying himself as security and demanding the person come forward. The figure did not move. Liam began walking toward it, his flashlight trained on the shape. As he got closer, he realized it was not a person. It was a mannequin, an old medical training mannequin used for teaching procedures, but the mannequin's head was turned toward him as if watching his approach. Liam felt a surge of adrenaline. Mannequins do not move their heads. He stopped about 10 meters away and studied the figure. It was definitely a mannequin, but something about it was wrong. The way it was positioned, the angle of the head. Then it moved. Not the jerky repositioning of something falling or shifting, but a smooth, deliberate turn. The mannequin's head rotated to face away from him, turning toward the darkness at the far end of the attic. Liam did not wait to see what happened next. He turned and ran. He ran down the stairs, through the hallway, down to the ground floor, and straight out of the building. He did not stop until he reached his car in the parking lot. He called his supervisor from the car, explaining what he had seen. His supervisor told him to go home and that someone else would cover the rest of his shift. The next day, Liam was asked to come to the office to discuss the incident. The demolition company was concerned. They brought in a team to search the building during daylight hours. They found the attic and the mannequin. It was lying on its side where Liam had last seen it. There was no evidence of anyone else being in the building. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the dust. Nothing to explain what Liam had witnessed. The company offered Liam a different assignment. He refused, saying he was done with that building. He quit the security position entirely. Other guards were hired to cover the remaining months before demolition. Several of them reported hearing strange sounds and feeling uncomfortable in the building, but none experienced anything as dramatic as Liam had. The demolition proceeded as planned in January 2016. When workers began dismantling the basement, they made a discovery that validated some of Liam's concerns. Behind a false wall in one of the basement storage rooms, they found a concealed space approximately 3 meters by 4 meters. Inside were patient records dating from 1960 to 1975, specifically related to children who had been housed at the facility during that period. Many of the records documented procedures and treatments that would be considered abusive by modern standards. Electroshock therapy administered to children as young as 8, extended periods of physical restraint, experimental medications. The records had been deliberately hidden, likely to avoid scrutiny or legal liability when treatment standards changed. The discovery led to a provincial investigation. Survivors of the facility were contacted, and several came forward to testify about their experiences as children. The investigation confirmed that significant abuses had occurred during that time period, and formal apologies were issued. But it did not explain what Liam had experienced: the singing, the moving mannequin, the overwhelming sense of wrongness that permeated the building. Those elements remained unexplained. Liam never returned to security work. He found employment in a warehouse and tried to put the experience behind him. But he could not forget the sound of children singing in an empty basement, or the sight of a mannequin turning its head to watch him in the darkness. Harper was a 23-year-old graduate student from Calgary, studying environmental science at the University of Alberta. In the summer of 2012, she planned a weekend camping trip with 3 friends to Kananaskis Country, a vast provincial park system in the Canadian Rockies about an hour west of Calgary. Harper was an experienced outdoors person who had grown up hiking and camping with her family throughout Alberta. She was comfortable in the wilderness, knew basic survival skills, and always took appropriate safety precautions. The group consisted of Harper, her roommate Jessica, and 2 other friends from university, Daniel and Marcus. They had planned the trip for weeks, researching trails, checking weather forecasts, and preparing their gear. They arrived at the trailhead on Friday afternoon, July 13th, 2012, and hiked approximately 6 kilometers to a designated backcountry campsite near a small alpine lake. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm temperatures during the day, and cool but comfortable conditions at night. They set up their tents, prepared dinner, and spent the evening sitting around the campfire, talking, and enjoying the scenery. The area was remote but not isolated. The trail they had hiked was well-maintained and popular with backpackers. Other campers were visible at sites across the lake, though none were in their immediate vicinity. Around 10:30 in the evening, Harper excused herself from the campfire to use the bathroom. The designated toilet facilities were located about 75 meters from their campsite, following a small trail through the trees. Harper took a flashlight and walked toward the facilities. Her friends continued their conversation around the fire. They estimated she had been gone about 5 minutes when Daniel commented that it seemed like she was taking a while. Jessica agreed and called out Harper's name. There was no response. After another minute, Jessica walked to the toilet area to check on her. Harper was not there. Jessica called her name louder. No response. She returned to the campsite and told Daniel and Marcus that Harper was not at the facilities. The three of them began searching immediately. They walked the trail between the campsite and the toilet area multiple times, calling Harper's name continuously. They expanded their search, moving through the surrounding forest with flashlights, shouting, and listening for any response. There was none. By midnight, they were panicked. They hiked back to the trailhead in the dark, a dangerous undertaking but necessary to reach their vehicle and call for help. Cell service was available at the parking area. They called emergency services at 12:45 in the morning. Parks Canada dispatch was notified, and a search and rescue operation was initiated. Search teams arrived at first light on Saturday morning. They conducted a systematic search of the area around the campsite, expanding outward in concentric circles. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopter overflights with thermal imaging cameras scanned the region. Volunteers from local search and rescue organizations joined the effort. Over the next 3 days, more than 100 people participated in the search, covering over 50 square kilometers of rugged mountain terrain. They found no trace of Harper. No footprints beyond the immediate campsite area. No torn clothing. No signs of struggle. Nothing to indicate where she had gone. On Tuesday morning, July 17th, search teams made a discovery that deepened the mystery. Approximately 2 kilometers northeast of the original campsite, in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, they found Harper's sleeping bag. It was laid out flat on the ground, perfectly arranged as if someone had prepared it for sleeping. The sleeping bag was unzipped and spread open. There was no other equipment nearby. No backpack, no personal items. Just the sleeping bag. The location was accessible only by bushwhacking through thick undergrowth with no trails leading to it. Search coordinators could not understand how the sleeping bag had ended up there or why it had been arranged so deliberately. The search intensified around this new location. Teams combed every meter of the surrounding forest. They checked for caves, ravines, or any geographic features that might explain what had happened. They found nothing. On Thursday morning, July 19th, a search dog alerted its handler to something in a heavily wooded area about 12 kilometers from the original campsite. The handler followed the dog and found Harper. She was alive but unresponsive, walking in slow circles in a small open area between the trees. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn when she disappeared. Her feet were bare. Her shoes were missing. She appeared dazed, her eyes open but unfocused. The handler called for medical assistance. Paramedics reached the location within 40 minutes and conducted an initial assessment. Harper was conscious but did not respond to questions. Her vital signs were stable. She showed no obvious injuries. Her skin was cold to the touch, but her core body temperature was within normal range. She was dehydrated and appeared exhausted. She was transported by helicopter to a hospital in Calgary for a full medical evaluation. Her friends and family were notified immediately and met her at the hospital. Medical examinations revealed a series of baffling findings. Harper had been missing for 5 days in wilderness conditions where nighttime temperatures dropped to near freezing. She had no food or water during that time, yet she showed only mild dehydration and no signs of significant malnutrition. She had no frostbite despite having bare feet. Her feet showed minor abrasions, consistent with walking on rough ground, but nothing severe. She had no insect bites, no scratches from vegetation, and no bruising or other injuries. Physically, she appeared almost as if she had been protected from the environment during those 5 days. The most concerning issue was her mental state. Harper remained unresponsive for the first 12 hours after being found. She stared blankly and did not react to stimuli. Neurological tests were conducted. Brain scans showed no abnormalities. By the second day, she began to regain some awareness. She recognized her family and friends, but seemed confused about where she was and what had happened. Over the following week, her cognitive function gradually returned, but she had no memory of the missing 5 days. The last thing she remembered was leaving the campfire to use the bathroom. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. Investigators interviewed Harper extensively once she had recovered sufficiently. They walked her through everything she could recall from the camping trip. She remembered every detail up until the moment she left the campsite. After that, nothing. No images, no sensations, no memories whatsoever. Psychologists were consulted. They noted that traumatic amnesia could result from extreme stress or psychological trauma, but Harper showed no signs of having experienced trauma. She was not anxious or fearful when discussing the incident. She simply had a complete blank in her memory. Her friends were also interviewed multiple times. Their accounts were consistent. Harper had been gone for approximately 5 to 7 minutes before they realized something was wrong. The timeline made no sense. In that brief period, Harper had somehow traveled from the campsite to a location 2 kilometers away, where her sleeping bag was found, then continued on to a location 12 kilometers from the original campsite, where she was discovered 5 days later. Even if she had been walking continuously, the distance and terrain would have been challenging to cover in 5 days, let alone while apparently not eating, drinking, or caring for herself. The sleeping bag became a focal point of the investigation. Harper confirmed it was hers. It had been in her tent at the campsite. Her friends confirmed they had not seen her take it when she left to use the bathroom. She had carried only a flashlight. Yet the sleeping bag ended up 2 kilometers away, carefully laid out in a clearing that had no trails leading to it. No one could explain how it got there. Search and rescue personnel noted that the location was difficult to reach even in daylight with proper equipment. Harper would have had to navigate through dense forest in the dark to reach it. The shoes Harper had been wearing when she disappeared were never found. Search teams looked for them specifically but found nothing. This detail troubled investigators because it suggested Harper had removed her shoes at some point during the 5 days. But why? And where? And why were they not located anywhere along the search routes? Harper herself could provide no insight. She did not remember removing her shoes or walking barefoot through the forest. In the months following the incident, Harper experienced additional strange symptoms. She had severe night terrors, waking up screaming, but unable to recall what she had dreamed about. She developed an intense aversion to forests and wooded areas. Even being near trees caused her anxiety. She had to withdraw from a field research course that would have required her to work in forested environments. Psychologists diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder, though there was no identifiable trauma to explain the condition. She underwent therapy for over a year to manage the symptoms. Harper also experienced significant memory gaps unrelated to the incident itself. She would lose track of time, finding herself in different locations with no recollection of how she got there. These episodes were brief, lasting only a few minutes, but they were disturbing. Medical evaluations ruled out seizures or other neurological conditions. The episodes gradually decreased in frequency over time but never completely stopped. As of recent years, Harper still experiences occasional time distortions and memory lapses. The case attracted attention from various researchers interested in missing persons phenomena in wilderness areas. Some pointed to similarities with other cases where people disappeared briefly and were found alive, but with no memory of what happened. Others noted the unusual details: the arranged sleeping bag, the lack of injuries despite exposure, the complete memory loss. No satisfactory explanation was ever developed. Parks Canada conducted a review of the incident and implemented additional safety protocols for backcountry camping, but acknowledged they had no understanding of what had actually occurred. Harper's family struggled to make sense of the experience. Her parents researched similar cases and found a handful of comparable incidents scattered across North America. People who disappeared in wilderness areas were found days later with no memory and minimal physical effects, and showed signs of having traveled impossible distances in impossible time frames. None of these cases had been solved. The patterns were suggestive, but offered no concrete answers. Harper eventually completed her degree but changed her career path away from field research. She took a position with an environmental consulting firm where her work was primarily office-based. She avoided camping and hiking for years after the incident. Her friends from that camping trip remained supportive, but the experience had changed their relationship. There was an unspoken understanding that something inexplicable had happened, something that none of them could process or understand. To this day, Harper refuses to return to Kananaskis country. She has declined all media requests for interviews about the incident. She wants to move on with her life and not be defined by those missing 5 days. But the questions remain. Where was she during that time? How did she survive with no food or water? Why does she have no memory? What happened to her sleeping bag and her shoes? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what caused the psychological trauma that continues to affect her years later, despite having no conscious memory of any traumatic event. The case remains listed in Parks Canada files as an unexplained incident. Search and rescue personnel who participated still discuss it occasionally, acknowledging that it defies conventional understanding. Harper's experience stands as a reminder that even in well-traveled wilderness areas, things can happen that fall outside the boundaries of normal explanation. And sometimes, the people who experience those things come back changed in ways they cannot articulate or understand. Noah was a freelance journalist from Toronto who specialized in long-form investigative pieces about forgotten places and abandoned communities across Canada. He had built a modest reputation writing for online magazines and regional newspapers, focusing on stories that explored the intersection of history, geography, and human experience. In the summer of 2008, when he was 31 years old, Noah decided to research a series of articles about ghost towns in the Yukon territory. He was particularly interested in Snag, a tiny community that had once been a weather station and refueling stop for aircraft during World War II, and had since been almost completely abandoned. Snag is located in southwestern Yukon, about 25 kilometers from the Alaska border. It sits in a valley surrounded by mountains, one of the coldest inhabited places in North America. In 1947, Snag recorded a temperature of minus 63 degrees Celsius, one of the lowest temperatures ever measured in continental North America. By 2008, only a handful of people still lived in the area, mostly indigenous trappers and hunters who maintained seasonal camps. The old weather station buildings and military structures had long since been abandoned, slowly deteriorating under the assault of extreme weather and time. Noah arrived in Snag on August 14, 2008, driving a rented four-wheel drive vehicle from Whitehorse, a journey of approximately 400 kilometers on rough gravel roads. He had arranged to stay at a small lodge owned by a local trapper about 15 kilometers from the old settlement. His plan was to spend 4 or 5 days exploring the area, photographing the abandoned structures, and interviewing any remaining residents about the community's history. He was an experienced solo traveler, always well prepared with emergency supplies, satellite phone, and detailed maps. On his second day, August 15th, Noah drove to the abandoned section of Snag to begin his documentation. The area was eerie in its emptiness. Collapsed wooden buildings, rusted equipment scattered across the ground, a few concrete foundations marking where larger structures had once stood. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind moving through the valley. Noah spent several hours taking photographs and making notes. Around mid-afternoon, he decided to explore the area beyond the main settlement, following an old road that led toward what had been a mine operation in the surrounding hills. Approximately 2 kilometers from the main site, Noah noticed tire tracks in the dirt road. Fresh tracks. This surprised him because the lodge owner had told him virtually no one came to this area anymore. The tracks were recent, made within the past day or two based on their clarity. They led away from the main settlement toward an area of low hills covered with sparse vegetation. Noah decided to follow them, curious about who might be in such a remote location. The tracks led him to an old mine shaft that the lodge owner had mentioned, but warned him to avoid because abandoned mines were dangerous and unstable. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, with wooden support beams rotting and rocks scattered across the opening. But the tire tracks led directly to it and stopped. Someone had driven here recently and presumably entered the mine or at least approached it closely. Noah parked his vehicle and walked toward the entrance. That was when he noticed something unusual, a heavy-duty power cable running from a small diesel generator hidden behind some rocks near the entrance. The generator was modern, not more than a few years old, and it was running quietly. Someone had electrical power in this abandoned mine. Noah felt a mixture of curiosity and unease. This was not normal. Abandoned mines did not have functioning generators. He called out, identifying himself as a journalist and asking if anyone was present. No response. He approached the mine entrance carefully, using his flashlight to peer inside. The shaft extended into darkness, sloping downward at a moderate angle. The wooden support beams looked precarious, but the main tunnel appeared passable. Noah made a decision that he would later question repeatedly. He entered the mine to investigate. The tunnel was narrow, perhaps 2 meters wide and 2 meters high. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and decay. Noah moved slowly, testing each step to ensure the ground was stable. After about 20 meters, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. This appeared to be an old work area where miners would have sorted ore or stored equipment. Noah swept his flashlight around the space and froze. The chamber was occupied, not by people but by evidence of recent habitation. There were blankets stacked neatly in one corner, food supplies, bottled water, a small camping stove, and covering one entire wall were photographs. Dozens of photographs, all of people. Noah approached the wall and examined the photos more closely. They were not random images. Each photograph showed a different person, and beneath each photo was handwritten information, names, dates, locations, physical descriptions. The information was detailed and methodical. Noah recognized immediately that he was looking at some kind of tracking system. He pulled out his camera and began photographing the wall. As he worked, he started reading the information more carefully. The names meant nothing to him initially, but the locations caught his attention. Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, Prince George, cities and towns scattered across Western Canada and the territories. Noah counted 37 photographs. Some were clearly printed from online sources. Others appeared to be surveillance photos taken without the subject's knowledge. The dates ranged from 2003 to 2008, Noah felt his heart rate increase. This was not normal. This felt very wrong. He continued photographing everything, trying to document as much as possible. At the bottom of each section of photographs was a single word written in black marker: taken. The same word repeated after each cluster of images: taken, taken, taken. Noah began to feel genuine fear. He needed to leave and report this to authorities immediately. As Noah was preparing to exit the chamber, he heard something that made him stop breathing. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps echoing from deeper in the mine, from a tunnel he had not noticed leading away from the chamber. Someone was coming. Noah turned off his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall near the entrance to the chamber. The footsteps grew louder, slow, and deliberate. A light appeared in the tunnel, a flashlight beam moving methodically. Noah realized he had no good options. If he tried to leave now, whoever was approaching would see or hear him. If he stayed, he would be discovered when they entered the chamber. He decided to run. He turned on his flashlight and sprinted toward the mine entrance. Behind him, he heard a shout. The footsteps became faster, running. Noah crashed through the tunnel, not caring about the stability of the structure, focused only on reaching the exit. He burst out into daylight and ran to his vehicle. He could hear someone still behind him in the mine. He started the engine and drove away as fast as the rough road would allow. He did not look back. He drove directly to the lodge, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. At the lodge, Noah used the satellite phone to call the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Whitehorse. He reported everything he had seen: the photographs, the names and dates, the word taken beneath each cluster, the person chasing him from the mine. The dispatcher took the information seriously and told Noah that officers would be sent to his location and to the mine to investigate. Noah was instructed to remain at the lodge and not return to the area alone. He agreed. He spent the next several hours reviewing the photographs he had taken, trying to calm himself and waiting for the police to arrive. 2 RCMP officers reached the lodge around 9 in the evening. Noah provided a detailed statement and showed them the photographs from his camera. The officers examined the images carefully. They asked Noah to describe the exact location of the mine and the route he had taken. They radioed for additional support and told Noah they would investigate the site immediately. Noah offered to guide them, but they refused, saying it was potentially dangerous, and they did not want civilians involved. They left for the mine site just after 10 in the evening. The officers returned to the lodge around 2 in the morning. Noah was still awake, too anxious to sleep. The officers told him they had found the mine entrance exactly where he had described. But when they entered, the chamber was empty. No generator, no power cables, no blankets or food supplies, no photographs on the walls. The EU chamber was completely bare, just rock and dirt. They had searched thoroughly, checking every surface, looking for any indication that the items Noah described had been there. They found nothing. No marks on the walls where photographs might have been attached. No indentations in the dirt where equipment might have been placed. Nothing. Noah insisted he had seen everything. He showed them his camera again. The officers looked at the screen. The photographs Noah had taken inside the mine showed only darkness, empty chamber walls, no images of the photographs he had documented, no pictures of the supplies, just dark, empty rock. Noah could not understand what he was seeing. He had taken those pictures. He had been there. He had seen everything. But the camera contained no evidence. The officers were professional but skeptical. They asked if Noah had been drinking or using any substances. He insisted he had not. They asked if he had any history of mental health issues. He said no. They told him they would file a report, but that without physical evidence, there was little they could investigate. Noah was devastated. He knew what he had seen. He tried to remember details, the names on the photographs. He had not written them down, relying on his camera to document everything. He could only recall a few: Sarah, Jennifer, Michael. Common names that would be difficult to search for without more specific information. He remembered some of the dates: 2005, 2007, 2008. But without full names or more details, the information was nearly useless. He stayed awake the rest of the night, going through his memory again and again, trying to hold on to the details. The next morning, Noah decided he could not continue his research project. He packed his belongings and drove back to Whitehorse. On the drive, he tried to make sense of what had happened. Had he hallucinated the entire experience? That seemed impossible. Everything had been so clear, so detailed. Had someone cleaned the chamber between his escape and the police arrival? That would require incredible speed and coordination. The timing seemed too tight. And how would his camera have been affected? He had no explanation. In Whitehorse, Noah filed a formal report with the RCMP, providing every detail he could remember. He requested that they investigate missing persons cases from the locations he had seen listed in the mine. The RCMP agreed to look into it but made no promises. Noah returned to Toronto a week later, the trip cut short and his article abandoned. He tried to follow up with the RCMP over the following months. They confirmed they had investigated but found no pattern of missing persons that matched the information he provided. The few names he could remember did not correspond to any active cases in their system. Noah became somewhat obsessed with the incident. He spent months searching online databases of missing persons, trying to find matches to the limited information he retained. He found a few cases that seemed to fit the general time frame and locations, but without the specific details from the photographs, he could not establish any definite connections. He reached out to other journalists and researchers interested in missing persons cases, sharing his story. Most were sympathetic, but could offer no concrete assistance without evidence. The experience changed Noah's career. He stopped writing about abandoned places and shifted his focus to investigative reporting on missing persons cases. He felt compelled to honor what he had seen, even if he could not prove it. He produced several well-researched articles highlighting unsolved disappearances in Western Canada. Some of the families of missing persons contacted him, grateful for the attention his work brought to their cases. But Noah never publicly detailed what he had experienced in the Yukon mine. He feared being dismissed as unreliable or mentally unstable. To this day, Noah maintains that he saw exactly what he described: a hidden chamber in an abandoned mine, photographs of missing persons, detailed tracking information, and the word "taken" marking each cluster of images. He believes someone was using that remote location to document crimes or to plan them. He believes the photographs represented real people who had disappeared. But without evidence, his belief remains just that, a belief. The RCMP file on the incident was closed after no corroborating evidence could be found. The case remains an unexplained anomaly. Noah still occasionally searches missing persons databases, hoping to recognize a name or face from his memory. So far, he has found nothing definitive. The mystery of what he saw in that mine shaft in Snag, Yukon, remains unsolved. Charlotte was a 41-year-old accountant living in Montreal when she inherited her grandmother's farmhouse in rural Quebec in the spring of 2016. Her grandmother, Marguerite Beaumont, had passed away at the age of 93 after a long illness. Charlotte had visited the farmhouse many times as a child, but had not been there in over 15 years. The property was located outside a small town called Sainte-Marie-de-Beauce, approximately 90 kilometers south of Quebec City. The farmhouse itself dated back to the 1800s and had been in the Beaumont family for 4 generations. It sat on 20 hectares of mixed farmland and forest, isolated from the nearest neighbors by at least a kilometer in any direction. Charlotte drove to the property in early May 2016 to begin the process of clearing out her grandmother's belongings and deciding whether to sell the house or keep it. The building was in reasonable condition considering its age. The structure was sound, though the interior needed updating. Her grandmother had lived alone there for the final 20 years of her life, maintaining a simple existence with minimal modern conveniences. Charlotte planned to spend a week sorting through possessions, making an inventory, and determining what repairs would be needed if she decided to sell. The first 2 days were spent organizing the main floor and bedrooms. Charlotte found the usual accumulation of a long life: clothing, books, kitchen items, photographs. Nothing unexpected. On the third day, she decided to tackle the attic, a large space running the length of the house that her grandmother had used for storage. Charlotte climbed the narrow stairs and found herself surrounded by decades of accumulated items: old furniture, boxes of papers, trunks filled with linens, and clothing from various eras. The air was dusty and smelled of age and wood. Charlotte worked methodically, opening boxes and making notes about contents. Around mid-afternoon, she noticed a chest she had not seen before. It was pushed into a corner beneath the eaves, partially hidden by a stack of old suitcases. The chest was made of dark wood, approximately 1 meter long and half a meter wide. It had a heavy padlock securing the lid. Charlotte searched for a key but could not find one. She considered breaking the lock, but decided first to check her grandmother's personal belongings for keys. She went downstairs and searched through her grandmother's bedroom. In the drawer of the bedside table, Charlotte found a small metal box containing various keys. One looked old enough to match the chest. She returned to the attic and tried the key. It fit. The lock opened with a metallic click. Charlotte lifted the lid and found the chest filled with papers, letters. Dozens of letters, all handwritten in French on yellowed paper. She carefully removed the top letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, written in faded black ink. The letter was dated June 12, 1940, and began with the salutation, "My dearest friend." Charlotte read through the letter. It was written by someone named Isabel, describing her fear and desperation. She wrote about hiding in the farmhouse, about being terrified of the men in the woods who came during every full moon. She described hearing them outside at night, calling her name, scratching at the doors and windows. She wrote that she could not go to the authorities because no one would believe her. The letter ended with a plea for help, asking the recipient to send assistance before the next full moon. Charlotte felt a chill run through her. She picked up another letter. It was also from Isabel, dated July 20th, 1940. This letter was more frantic. Isabel wrote that she had been found once, but had escaped. She described being chased through the forest and hiding in a root cellar for 2 days without food or water. Charlotte continued reading through the letters chronologically. There were 43 in total, spanning from March 1940 to December 1945. They documented Isabel's deteriorating mental state and increasing terror. She wrote about seeing faces in the windows, about finding symbols carved into trees around the property, about discovering animal carcasses arranged in patterns near the house. The final letter, dated December 8, 1945, was barely legible. The handwriting was chaotic, with words crossed out and rewritten. Isabel wrote that they had found her again. She wrote that she could hear them at the door. The letter ended mid-sentence with the words, "They are at the door, and I cannot run anymore because..." Charlotte sat in the attic holding the final letter, her hands trembling. She had no idea who Isabel was or why these letters had been in her grandmother's attic. She decided to research the name. She spent the rest of the afternoon searching online and making calls to local historical societies. By evening, she had found information that made the letters even more disturbing. Isabelle Mercier had been a young woman who lived in the area during World War II. She had been reported missing in January 1946 by her sister. A search had been conducted. Isabel's body was found 3 weeks later in the forest, approximately 5 kilometers from the Beaumont farmhouse. The official cause of death was listed as exposure to cold, but the autopsy report noted unusual trauma inconsistent with natural exposure. Charlotte contacted the local historical society and learned more. Isabel had been 26 years old when she disappeared. She had worked as a seamstress and lived with her elderly mother in town. Neighbors reported that Isabel had been acting strangely in the months before her disappearance, claiming she was being followed and watched. Her mother said Isabel would sometimes leave for days without explanation, returning exhausted and frightened. The police at the time had investigated but found no evidence of foul play beyond the unusual trauma noted in the autopsy. The case had been closed as an unfortunate death, likely the result of Isabel wandering while suffering from some form of mental distress. Charlotte showed the letters to a historian at the society. The historian authenticated them as genuine documents from the 1940s based on the paper, ink, and writing style. But the historian could not explain why they had been stored in the Beaumont farmhouse or to whom they had been addressed. Charlotte asked her surviving relatives about Isabel Mercier. None had heard the name. Her mother, Marguerite's daughter, had no knowledge of the letters or any connection between her grandmother and a woman named Isabel. Charlotte was left with more questions than answers. She decided to investigate further. She contacted the local police to see if records still existed from the 1940s investigation. The police located archived files and sent copies to Charlotte. The files contained the original police reports, witness statements, and the autopsy findings. The autopsy was particularly disturbing. It described multiple contusions on Isabel's body that could not be explained by a fall or exposure. There were marks on her wrists and ankles consistent with restraints. The medical examiner at the time had noted these findings, but had ultimately concluded that Isabel must have injured herself while disoriented in the forest. The report mentioned that her body showed signs of prolonged malnourishment, suggesting she had been without proper food for an extended period. Charlotte also found references in the police files to other incidents in the area during that time. Several reports of strange activities in the forests around Sainte-Marie-de-Beauce. Farmers reporting finding animal remains arranged in unusual patterns. Witnesses claiming to have seen groups of people moving through the woods at night carrying torches. One report from November 1943 described a farmer who discovered symbols carved into trees on his property, symbols that resembled occult markings. The police had investigated these reports but found no evidence of criminal activity. Most had been dismissed as wartime paranoia or local superstition. Charlotte became increasingly unsettled by what she was learning. She wondered if the men Isabel had written about in her letters were connected to these other reports. She wondered if there had been some kind of group operating in the area during the war years, targeting vulnerable people. She wondered why her grandmother had possessed these letters. Had Marguerite known Isabel? Had Isabel hidden in the farmhouse at some point? Charlotte tried to piece together a timeline, but found too many gaps in the available information. She decided to speak with longtime residents of Sainte-Marie-de-Beauce who might remember stories from that era. She found several elderly people willing to talk. Most had only vague recollections of the war years, but one man, 94 years old, remembered Isabel Mercier. He said she had been a quiet woman who kept to herself. He said there had been rumors that she was involved with the wrong people, though he could not recall specifics. He mentioned that his own father had told him to stay away from certain parts of the forest because bad things happened there during the war. When Charlotte pressed for details, the man said his father had never elaborated, and the subject had been considered taboo in the community. Charlotte also learned from the Historical Society that several people had gone missing from the region between 1940 and 1946. Not a large number, but more than would be typical for such a small population. Most of these cases had been attributed to the chaos of the war years. Young men had left to enlist and never returned. Some people had fled to cities seeking work. Others had simply disappeared without explanation. The Historical Society had documented 10 such cases. In addition to Isabel Mercier, 3 others had been found dead in circumstances described as unusual or suspicious. The remaining 6 were never found. Charlotte tried to determine if there was any connection between these cases and the letters she had found. She cross-referenced dates and locations but could establish no definitive links. The letters mentioned only Isabel's personal experiences and did not reference other victims. Charlotte was left with a profound sense of unease. She felt that her grandmother's farmhouse had been connected to something dark, something that had never been properly investigated or resolved. She decided she could not sell the property without understanding more. Over the following months, Charlotte made multiple trips to Quebec to continue her research. She hired a genealogist to trace connections between her grandmother's family and Isabelle Mercier. The genealogist found that Isabelle and Marguerite had been distant cousins, related through a common ancestor from the 1860s. This connection suggested that Isabelle might have sought refuge with Marguerite during her time of fear, which would explain why the letters were in the farmhouse. But it did not explain why Marguerite had never mentioned Isabelle or why the letters had been locked in a chest in the attic. Charlotte also consulted with experts in historical crimes and occult practices. Some suggested that the men in the woods Isabelle described could have been members of a secret society or cult that operated in rural Quebec during the war. Such groups were not unheard of, particularly in isolated regions where traditional authority was weakened by wartime conditions. Others suggested that Isabelle might have been suffering from paranoid delusions and that the letters reflected her deteriorating mental state rather than actual events. Charlotte found both explanations unsatisfying. The physical evidence of Isabelle's death, the unusual trauma noted in the autopsy, suggested something real had happened to her. As Charlotte's investigation continued, she began to encounter resistance. Some longtime residents of Sainte-Marie-de-Beauce did not want her digging into the past. She received anonymous phone calls telling her to stop asking questions. One elderly woman she interviewed became visibly distressed when Charlotte mentioned the letters and asked her to leave immediately. Charlotte felt she was touching on something the community had collectively decided to forget. She persisted, but eventually reached a point where no new information was available. The trail had gone cold decades ago, and too many people who might have known the truth had passed away. Charlotte made the decision to keep the farmhouse, but not to live there. She could not shake the feeling that the property held memories of suffering and fear. She donated the letters to the provincial archives, where they could be preserved and studied by historians. She wrote a detailed account of everything she had learned and submitted it to researchers interested in unsolved historical cases. To date, no one has provided a definitive explanation for what happened to Isabelle Mercier or who the men in the woods were. The case remains an unsolved mystery, a dark chapter in the history of rural Quebec that was never properly addressed. Charlotte visits the farmhouse occasionally to maintain the property, but she has never spent a night there. The weight of what might have happened within those walls and in the surrounding forests is too heavy to bear. Lucas was a 42-year-old long-haul truck driver based out of Regina, Saskatchewan. He had been driving commercial trucks for over 20 years, primarily hauling freight along the northern routes that connected remote communities across the western provinces and territories. It was demanding work that required long hours alone on isolated highways. But Lucas appreciated the solitude and the decent income it provided. He was meticulous about safety, maintaining his vehicle properly and always following protocols. In his 2 decades of driving, he had never had a serious accident or major incident. He was known among other drivers as reliable and professional. In February 2019, Lucas was assigned a run that would take him from Regina to Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, a journey of approximately 2,000 kilometers through some of the most remote terrain in Canada. The route followed Highway 16 through Saskatchewan into Alberta, then Highway 35 north through Alberta into the Northwest Territories. The final stretch along Highway 3 to Yellowknife was particularly isolated, with minimal services and long distances between communities. Lucas had driven this route dozens of times and was comfortable with its challenges. He departed Regina on the evening of February 11th, planning to drive through the night when traffic was light and road conditions were typically better. The weather forecast called for clear skies and cold temperatures, favorable conditions for winter driving. Lucas made good time through Saskatchewan and Alberta, stopping only for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. By the morning of February 13th, he was on Highway 3 heading north toward Yellowknife. He estimated he would reach his destination by late afternoon. Around 10 in the morning, Lucas stopped at a rest area approximately 150 kilometers south of Yellowknife. The rest area was basic, just a small parking lot with a concrete building housing restrooms. There were no other vehicles present when Lucas pulled in. He parked his truck, grabbed his thermos for coffee, and walked toward the building. As he approached the restrooms, he noticed something unusual. A small notebook was sitting on top of a garbage can near the entrance. The notebook looked out of place, deliberately positioned as if someone wanted it to be found. Lucas picked up the notebook and opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, dates, times, and detailed descriptions. He flipped through several pages, trying to understand what he was looking at. Then the content became clear. The notebook contained logs of vehicles, specific descriptions of trucks and cars, including make, model, color, and license plate numbers. Next to each vehicle description was a date, a time, and a location. All the locations were along Highway 3 or nearby roads in the Northwest Territories. Lucas felt a growing sense of unease as he continued reading. At the bottom of each page, beneath the vehicle descriptions, was a single word written in capital letters: taken. The word appeared after clusters of vehicle entries, sometimes after 3 or 4 vehicles, sometimes after more. Lucas counted quickly. There were approximately 40 vehicle descriptions in the notebook, spanning what appeared to be 3 years based on the dates. The most recent entry was dated February 10th, 2019, just 3 days earlier. Lucas felt his heart rate increase. This was wrong. This felt very wrong. He looked around the rest area. No other vehicles had arrived. The highway was empty in both directions. He was completely alone. Lucas made a decision. He walked quickly back to his truck, notebook in hand, and locked himself inside. He pulled out his cell phone but had no signal. Cell coverage along this stretch of highway was non-existent. He would need to drive to the next town to make a call. But first, he wanted to document what he had found. He used his phone to photograph every page of the notebook, ensuring he captured all the vehicle descriptions and dates. As Lucas was photographing the final pages, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the license plate numbers listed looked familiar. He checked his own vehicle registration documents. The license plate matched a truck that belonged to his company, a truck driven by another driver named Michael who frequently ran northern routes. Lucas tried to remember when he had last seen Michael. It had been several weeks. He made a mental note to ask dispatch about Michael's status as soon as he reached an area with phone service. Lucas put the notebook on the passenger seat and started his engine. He wanted to get away from the rest area immediately. As he pulled back onto the highway, he checked his mirrors constantly, watching for any vehicles behind him. The highway remained empty. He drove for 40 minutes before reaching a small service station that had a payphone. He parked and went inside. The attendant, a middle-aged woman, greeted him. Lucas asked to use the phone and called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police emergency line. The dispatcher answered. Lucas explained where he was and what he had found. He described the notebook, the vehicle descriptions, and the word taken, written after each cluster. The dispatcher took the information seriously and asked Lucas to remain at the service station until officers could respond. Lucas agreed. He purchased coffee and waited. The service station had weak cell signal, so he was able to call his company dispatch. He asked about Michael, the driver whose truck license plate was in the notebook. The dispatcher checked records and told Lucas that Michael had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. His truck had been found abandoned on Highway 3, but Michael himself had never been located. The case was under investigation. Lucas felt sick. He told the dispatcher about the notebook and that Michael's plate number was listed. The dispatcher said she would contact the authorities immediately with this information. Lucas hung up and returned to his truck to wait for police. 2 RCMP officers arrived approximately 90 minutes later. Lucas handed them the notebook and showed them the photographs he had taken on his phone. The officers examined the notebook carefully. They asked Lucas detailed questions about where he had found it, whether he had seen anyone else at the rest area, and whether he had touched anything else. Lucas answered as thoroughly as he could. The officers told Lucas they would need to take the notebook as evidence and that they would be launching an investigation immediately. They asked if Lucas was willing to provide a formal statement. He agreed. They took his contact information and told him they would be in touch. Lucas was cleared to continue his delivery to Yellowknife. He drove the remaining distance but could not shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. When he arrived at his destination and unloaded his cargo, he checked into a motel and tried to rest, but sleep would not come. Over the next few days, Lucas received updates from the RCMP. Investigators had begun cross-referencing the license plate numbers in the notebook with missing persons reports and vehicle recovery records. The results were disturbing. 12 of the license plates matched vehicles that had been found abandoned along northern highways over the past 3 years. In several cases, the drivers of those vehicles had never been located. These were cases that had been investigated individually but had never been connected. The notebook suggested a pattern. Someone had been tracking vehicles and their occupants. The word "taken" implied something sinister had happened to those drivers. The RCMP launched a major investigation. They increased patrols along Highway 3 and other northern routes. They issued alerts to trucking companies and other commercial drivers about the findings. They conducted forensic analysis of the notebook, looking for fingerprints or DNA evidence. They found multiple sets of prints, including Lucas's and several others that could not be immediately identified. They tested the paper and ink, determining the notebook had been manufactured recently, likely within the past 5 years. But they could not identify who had written the entries or left the notebook at the rest area. Investigators interviewed other drivers who regularly traveled northern routes. Several reported having seen suspicious activity over the years. Vehicles following them for long distances before suddenly disappearing. Unfamiliar people at rest areas who seemed to be watching rather than using the facilities. Items left in strange locations as if deliberately placed. None of these reports had seemed significant at the time, but in the context of the notebook, they took on new meaning. The RCMP began to suspect that a person or group had been targeting drivers on isolated highways, though the motive remained unclear. Lucas was interviewed multiple times as the investigation progressed. He provided every detail he could remember about finding the notebook. He tried to recall if he had seen any other vehicles near the rest area before he arrived, but he had not. The highway had been empty. Investigators asked if Lucas would be willing to return to the location with them to walk through exactly what had happened. He agreed. Several weeks later, he drove back to the rest area with RCMP officers and recreated his movements. The officers searched the entire area but found no additional evidence. The investigation also focused on finding the person responsible. Surveillance was set up at the rest area where Lucas had found the notebook. Cameras monitored the location continuously for months. No one appeared who matched descriptions of suspicious individuals reported by other drivers. The RCMP expanded their investigation to include similar rest areas and service stations along the highway. They found nothing. Whoever had left the notebook seemed to have vanished. The case attracted media attention. News outlets reported on the mysterious notebook and the missing drivers whose vehicles had been documented. Families of missing persons came forward, desperate for information about their loved ones. The RCMP held press conferences assuring the public that the investigation was ongoing and that safety measures had been increased on northern highways. But they could not provide answers about what had happened to the missing drivers or who was responsible. Lucas struggled with the psychological impact of his discovery. He continued working as a truck driver but avoided the northern routes for several months. When he finally returned to driving Highway 3, he was hypervigilant, constantly checking his surroundings and refusing to stop at isolated rest areas. Other drivers reported similar anxiety. The sense of safety that had existed on these routes had been shattered. Drivers now traveled in convoys when possible and communicated regularly with dispatch to confirm their locations. In June 2019, 4 months after Lucas found the notebook, the RCMP made an arrest. They detained a suspect in connection with one of the missing driver cases. The suspect was a drifter who had been living in various communities along Highway 3. Under questioning, the suspect admitted to breaking into abandoned vehicles, but denied any involvement in the disappearances. Forensic evidence linked the suspect to one of the abandoned trucks, but not to any of the missing persons. The suspect's fingerprints did not match any found on the notebook. Prosecutors determined there was insufficient evidence to charge the suspect with anything beyond theft, and he was eventually released. The investigation continued but produced no additional breakthroughs. The notebook remained the only tangible evidence suggesting a coordinated pattern of targeting drivers, but without a suspect or clear motive, investigators could not solve the cases. The RCMP kept the investigation active, periodically reviewing evidence and following up on new tips. To this day, the identity of the person who created the notebook and left it at the rest area remains unknown. The fates of the missing drivers, whose license plates were documented, remain unresolved. Lucas eventually left long-haul trucking. The stress of the discovery and the ongoing investigation had taken too much of a toll. He found work as a local delivery driver in Regina, staying close to home. He still thinks about the notebook and wonders if the person responsible will ever be caught. He wonders if there are other notebooks documenting other victims that have never been found. And he wonders why someone would meticulously track vehicles and drivers for years, only to leave evidence at a rest stop where anyone might find it. These questions haunt him, as they haunt the families of the missing and the investigators who continue to search for answers. Amelia was 7 years old when she disappeared from a community festival on Cape Sable Island, a small island community off the southern coast of Nova Scotia. The island had a population of fewer than 500 people, and the annual summer festival was one of the highlights of the year. It was held in late July, a weekend celebration that brought together residents and visitors for food, music, games, and fireworks. The festival took place at a large open field near the community center, surrounded by a forest on 3 sides and with views of the ocean on the 4th. It was 2007, and Amelia had been attending the festival with her parents and her older brother. The day had been perfect. Warm sunshine, gentle ocean breezes, and the excitement of children running between activity stations set up across the field. Amelia was wearing a bright yellow sundress that her mother had made for her, and her long brown hair was tied back with a matching yellow ribbon. She had been playing games with other children, winning small prizes, and eating cotton candy. Her parents had been watching her closely, as they always did, knowing that even in such a small community, vigilance was important. Around 6 in the evening, as the sun began to lower toward the horizon, Amelia asked her mother if she could go watch the face painting station that was set up near the edge of the field, about 40 meters from where her family was sitting. Her mother agreed, reminding Amelia to stay where she could be seen. Amelia skipped off toward the face painting tent. Her mother watched her arrive at the tent and join the small group of children waiting their turn. Her mother then turned her attention briefly to her son, who was asking for money to buy a snack. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 90 seconds. When her mother looked back toward the face painting station, Amelia was not there. Her mother called her father. Together, they walked quickly to the face painting tent. They asked the volunteer operating the station if she had seen Amelia. The volunteer said yes. A little girl in a yellow dress had been there just moments ago, but had walked away before getting her face painted. The volunteer pointed toward the tree line. saying the girl had walked in that direction. Amelia's parents immediately became concerned. They called her name loudly. Other festival attendees began to help search. Within minutes, dozens of people were looking for Amelia, calling her name, checking every tent and activity station, searching the parking area and the nearby beach. By 6:30, when Amelia had not been found, someone called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Officers arrived within 20 minutes and immediately organized a systematic search. They established a perimeter around the festival grounds and began searching the surrounding forest. Search dogs were brought in. As darkness fell, volunteers brought flashlights and continued searching through the night. The Coast Guard was notified in case Amelia had wandered to the shore and somehow entered the water. Helicopter overflights with thermal imaging began at first light on the following morning. The search continued for weeks. Over 200 volunteers participated at various times. Every meter of the island was searched multiple times. Forests were combed systematically. Shorelines were walked repeatedly. Abandoned buildings were checked. Wells and cisterns were examined. Boats searched the waters around the island. Nothing was found. No trace of Amelia. No torn clothing. No footprints beyond the festival grounds. No witnesses who had seen her after she walked away from the face painting tent. She had simply vanished. The investigation expanded beyond the island. Police looked at registered sex offenders in the region. They investigated recent visitors to the island. They interviewed every person who had attended the festival. Hundreds of statements were taken. No one reported seeing anything suspicious. No one had seen Amelia leave with anyone. No unfamiliar vehicles had been noticed in the area. The ferry schedule was checked to determine who had traveled to or from the island that day. Everyone who had taken the ferry was identified and interviewed. Nothing pointed to an abduction or foul play, yet a child had disappeared in broad daylight from a public event surrounded by adults. Amelia's family was devastated. Her parents appeared on local and national news, pleading for information. Posters with Amelia's photograph were distributed across Nova Scotia and beyond. The case received significant media coverage. Tips came in from across Canada, but none led anywhere. Psychics contacted the family offering to help, but their visions and predictions produced no useful information. As months passed with no breaks in the case, the active search efforts were scaled back. The RCMP maintained the investigation as open, but with no new leads, there was little they could do except wait for information. 3 years passed. Amelia's family never stopped hoping, but had begun to accept that they might never know what had happened to their daughter. Then, on an afternoon in late July 2010, exactly 3 years after her disappearance, Amelia walked out of the forest near her family's home. A neighbor saw her first and could not believe what she was seeing. The neighbor called Amelia's mother, her voice shaking. Amelia's mother ran outside and found her daughter standing in the yard, wearing the same yellow sundress she had worn the day she disappeared. The dress was not dirty or torn. Amelia looked exactly as she had 3 years earlier. She had not grown. She had not aged. Amelia's mother embraced her daughter, crying uncontrollably. She asked where Amelia had been. Amelia seemed confused by the question. She said she had been playing with other children. She said she had only been gone for a little while. She asked why her mother was so upset. Amelia's father arrived moments later, having been called by the neighbor. He scooped Amelia into his arms. The RCMP were notified immediately. Officers arrived within 30 minutes. They took Amelia and her family to the hospital in Yarmouth for medical evaluation. The medical examination revealed findings that defied explanation. Amelia showed no signs of malnutrition or dehydration. She had no injuries, no bruising, no indication of abuse or trauma of any kind. Her clothing was clean and in the same condition it had been when she disappeared. Her hair was still tied with the yellow ribbon, exactly as her mother had arranged it 3 years earlier. Most remarkably, Her physical development had not progressed. She had not grown at all. She was the same height and weight she had been at age 7. Her teeth had not changed. Medical records from before her disappearance confirmed that she should have grown several inches and gained significant weight during 3 years at that age. She had not. Amelia was interviewed by child psychologists and RCMP investigators trained in speaking with young victims. She was calm and cooperative, but could provide no useful information about where she had been. She insisted she had been playing with other children in a house in the woods. She described the house as having many rooms and large windows. She said the other children were nice and that they played games together. She said there were adults there too, but she could not describe them clearly. When asked how long she had been there, she said only an afternoon. She had no concept that 3 years had passed. Investigators asked Amelia to show them where the house was. She agreed. With her parents and police officers, she walked into the forest behind her family's home. She led them confidently, following a path only she seemed to see. After approximately 20 minutes of walking, she stopped in a small clearing. She pointed and said the house had been there. But there was no house. There was no structure of any kind. No foundation. No signs that any building had ever existed in that location. The forest showed no evidence of disturbance. Trees that were decades old stood where Amelia insisted a house had been. Investigators brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and archaeological experts. They searched the area extensively. They found nothing. No buried structures, no artifacts, no indication that the clearing had been anything other than forest. Amelia became upset when told there was no house. She insisted she could see it. She described it in detail, but no one else could see what she described. Medical professionals suggested she might be experiencing false memories or confabulation, psychological phenomena where the brain creates memories to fill gaps. But this did not explain the physical evidence: her lack of aging, her pristine clothing, her perfect health after 3 years of absence. DNA testing confirmed Amelia was indeed the same child who had disappeared. There was no question about her identity. Blood tests and other medical analyses found no drugs or chemicals in her system that might explain the lack of aging. Endocrinologists examined her and found no hormonal abnormalities. Geneticists found no mutations or conditions that would prevent normal growth. Every medical test came back normal. She was a healthy 7-year-old girl who should have been 10 years old. The case attracted international attention. Researchers in various fields proposed theories. Some suggested Amelia had been in a coma or vegetative state that slowed her aging, but medical evidence did not support this. Others proposed she had been kept in extremely controlled conditions that somehow preserved her physical state, but this seemed scientifically impossible. Paranormal researchers suggested supernatural explanations, but these were dismissed by mainstream investigators. No theory adequately explained all the evidence. Amelia's family tried to return to normal life. Amelia resumed attending school at the grade level appropriate for her current development rather than her chronological age. She struggled socially because she did not remember the 3 years that had passed and could not understand why the world seemed different. Her former classmates were now much older than her. She had to make new friends among younger children. She experienced confusion and frustration as she tried to adapt. Over time, Amelia began to develop normally. She grew and matured at a typical rate from the point of her return onward. Medical professionals continued to monitor her development, documenting the unusual case. Psychologically, she required ongoing therapy to process the experience and the gaps in her memory. She struggled with nightmares and anxiety. Though she could not articulate what frightened her, she developed an aversion to forests and refused to enter wooded areas. Even being near trees caused her significant distress. The RCMP investigation never identified what happened during the 3 missing years. They interviewed everyone on the island again. They investigated every possible lead. They consulted with experts from multiple disciplines. Nothing explained the disappearance or the return. The case files grew thick with reports and analyses, but answers remained elusive. Investigators acknowledged privately that the case defied conventional understanding and might never be solved. Amelia's family eventually made the difficult decision to relocate off the island. The constant attention and the traumatic associations made it impossible to heal while remaining in the community where everything had happened. They moved to a larger town where they could have more anonymity. They requested privacy from media and researchers. They wanted to give Amelia the chance to grow up as normally as possible, given the extraordinary circumstances. Today, Amelia is an adult. She has built a life, though she continues to carry the weight of those missing 3 years. She has no additional memories of what happened. Therapy and time have not unlocked those memories. The house in the woods remains vivid in her mind, but she has accepted that no one else can see it or verify its existence. She rarely speaks publicly about her experience, preferring to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on unanswerable questions. The case remains officially unsolved. It is listed in RCMP files as an unexplained disappearance and return. Researchers occasionally contact Amelia's family requesting permission to study the case further, but the family typically declines. They have shared what they can share. The rest belongs to Amelia, to guard or reveal as she chooses. The community of Cape Sable Island still speaks of the case in hushed tones, a reminder that even in small, close-knit communities, mysteries can occur that defy explanation and challenge everything we think we understand about reality.